Joe was here. But that's part of the...
So Rex gave you a whole list of things that apparently I am or have been. And I have to tell you that the one thing I never expected to be was a storyteller. In fact, I was supposed to be a lawyer. And it started like this. I was in 9th grade, and the high school debate coach came up to me in the hall and said, "Hey, you're Joe Tankersley." I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." Because back then that's what you said to teachers when they talked to you in the hall. She said, "You're on the debate team. The first meeting's next Tuesday. Be there. Don't be late." I said, sure. Now, I didn't get recruited to be on the debate team because I had anybody thought I had any skills. It turned out that I had an older brother. My older brother was the kind of older brother nobody wants, right? He was captain of the debate team, he was valedictorian, he was president of the scene, it goes on. We won't talk about that today. But it turned out that this was one of those amazing opportunities that just happened to mesh. I had the two things that were necessary to be a really good debater. The first one was I was really good at arguing, and my wife will tell you I'm still really good at it. The second thing was I was a big enough of a narcissist that I really liked to stand up in front of people and talk. So I went in whole hog. And I spent my high school years being one of those little nerds back before nerds were cool, and became a really successful high school debater because I had a great teacher and some great coaches. By the time I was a senior, I mean, we were well known around the country. We were really winning tournaments and everything else. And it was about that time that I was visiting my grandfather. And at the time, my grandfather was about 80 years old. He lived out in a rural area in Tennessee, ran a little country store back when there were country stores. And he was of a generation where typically they did not talk a lot about much of anything. And so we were in the store one day, he was slicing bologna or something like that on a big slicer. And he turned to me out of the blue and he said, "Joe, don't become a lawyer." And I thought, well, that's interesting. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was like, 17 years old. And everything I was thinking about had nothing to do with getting a job. It was more about law and war, but that's another story. But I sort of thought about that, and I went about my way, and it turned out because I was a debater, I got a chance to go to Emory University. So, part of my education was paid for. So I went to Emory and I had to debate. So I debated for another 4 years. And I don't know if any of you happen to know anything about collegiate debate. You probably don't. It's pretty obscure, pretty niche. But in that time, and even today, Emory University is like the Alabama is in football, Emory University is in college debate. So, big time. Everybody around me was incredibly successful. I got to be a senior in college. Everybody was talking about what law school they were going to, and I was like, I guess I should make a decision about what I'm going to do now. And that comment that my grandfather made to me popped up in my head. I still didn't know why, but I thought there was something about that. And you have to understand that I really idolized my grandfather. This is the important part of the story, right? He had grown up, born in 1880 something, right? Grew up at the beginning of the century, went to the 3rd grade. He'd been an incredibly successful businessman, an entrepreneur, started all sorts of business. And the most important part was during the Prohibition, he'd been a bootlegger. After the Prohibition, he got elected to be sheriff in the same county where he was a bootlegger. This is a man that you idolize, right? And so I thought about that, and I go, well, yeah, he must be right. So I chucked it all, 8 years of my life, and I went to film school. And I decided that I would be a filmmaker. I spent about a decade knocking around doing that, and I was incredibly lucky. I got to make some independent films, and thank goodness that was in the 1980s, so you can find the names, but you cannot find them on YouTube. And then completely by chance one day, I ended up at Walt Disney Imagineering. And that was kind of like the same way I became a debater. Somebody called me up and said, "Hey, you want to be a writer for Walt Disney Imagineering?" I said, "What are they? What do they do?" Sure, I'll do that. That's when I started my PhD in storytelling. For about the next 5 years, I lived in red ink. And any of you who have ever been an editor understand what's that mean. I was writing stuff that was stories for theme park attractions. I was writing stuff that was plaque copy for museum exhibits in the theme parks. I was writing signs that tell people how to get to the bathroom. And I couldn't get my boss to buy off on any of them, right? And I learned more in 5 years about what it takes to really, truly be a storyteller than I had in my entire life before that, because I had all of that red ink to deal with. And I learned 2 very important lessons. These are the lessons I hope you guys take from this. To be a good storyteller, you have to understand, number one, that it's not about you. And I think too many of us, particularly as writers, forget that. We think we're cute, we think we're smart, we think we know more than anybody else, and so we get heavy into us. But when you're dealing with people in the theme park, many of whom don't speak English as their first language, who've got some kid that's melting down, and it's Florida in the summertime, it's probably 100 degrees and 102% humidity. They don't want cute. They want to know where the damn bathroom is. They want to know what it is that they're looking at. So you have to start from a point as a storyteller, understanding that it's about your audience. It's about the people that you're dealing with. And the second thing that I learned that I think is incredibly important for all of you here today is I think story is one of the most powerful tools that we have to create change. And that's not just an abstract idea. We actually did that when I was at Imagineering. And I'm sure everybody here's been to Disney, right? I assume, if you haven't, please go, because my picture depends on it. We had something at Disney at Epcot called Interventions. I don't know if any of you have ever been there before. But it was a series of experiences, interactive experiences primarily. And our goal was to tell stories about topics that matter. You're in a theme park. You're there to see Mickey Mouse. And we bring you into this other room and tell you about how to create a home that was safer from bad weather, or how not to have your house burned down, or how to understand financial planning, right? Pretty difficult topics. But what we learned is if you took those topics and you put a story around them, and it was a good story, you could actually get people engaged, and most importantly, you could demonstrate, you could change people's behaviors. And I didn't believe it at first. I was really amazed by this. We did one project. It was called Storm Struck. And it was about what you need to do to make sure that you build a home that doesn't get blown away in a hurricane. Kind of an important thing if you live in Florida. And somebody from Carnegie Mellon came in and go, well, we want to prove whether or not this works. And they did a year-long study. And what they did was they looked at everybody before they went through the experienced the story. Then a year later, they connected with them again and said, hey, have you done anything different? And they reported that something like 50% of the people who went through this experience changed their behavior. Now, I don't know if any of you work in the world of social marketing, not social media, but social marketing, like public health, education, where you want to try to change behavior. 50% behavior change. Even if it's something as simple as we need to have an emergency kit to get out of here when they tell us it's time to leave, is amazing. And it wasn't because we were brilliant. It wasn't because we were smarter than anybody else. It was because we knew how to tell stories. So why am I telling you all of this? I mean, I know everybody here really wants to know about my history, right? I'm doing it for another reason. There are plenty of people out there who will give you advice on how to be a good writer, how to be a good storyteller. Some of it's better than others, but everybody's got an opinion. I think it's important for you guys to understand where I'm coming from. Because what I want to do is give you some specific strategies that I use. Strategies that I use for one purpose, is to change people's minds and to change their behaviors. And so you have to understand, I'm biased. I'm all about advocacy. I'm all about making a difference with the stories that I tell. And I want you to make sure you understand that that's the lens. Fair enough? Okay. The other thing before I talk about those tips, I just have to say this without sounding incredibly cliche. I think what you're doing is a sacred task. I really believe that creating stories that are about creating change, and particularly the one you guys are taking on, that has to do with how we educate and how we deal with our educators, is incredibly, incredibly important. So I'm really in awe of the work that you guys are doing, but I hope you take that kind of feeling toward it as you're moving it. So what about those tips? This is like, what is it? Who was it used to do the top 10 thing? Mine aren't nearly as funny as theirs. Okay. Betterment, right? Number one, embrace your voice. There were, I think, 1.4 million books released in 2017 in the United States. Many of them were self-published. They weren't all by publishers. Some of them will never be read by anyone. But there are plenty of people out there. And one of the things that happens with people when they start to write is they think they have to write like other people. They have to use a voice that's incredibly popular. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's actually some software where you can write a paragraph or a book. You can put it through the software and it will tell you that you're 60% Ernest Hemingway, or 50% John Patterson, or 99% whoever that was that wrote 50 Shades of Grey. You might not want that. Don't do that. We don't need their voices. We need your unique voices. And that's the only way that you're going to start to connect. And that's one of the things Rex talked about, right? It needs to come through you and your experience in your version. I'll talk about myself again for a minute, just to give you an example. The book that I've written is called Reimagining Our Tomorrows, Making Sure Your Future Doesn't Suck. Now, I started that book about 2 years ago. And at the time, I'm a consultant, a speaker, and I do all of that same kind of stuff, not nearly as good as Rex, but you know, a similar sort of thing. And everybody said, well, Joe, you have to write a book. That's how you do this. So I sat down and I started writing a book. And I started writing a book about what I did, which is basically using story to help people understand the future. And I talked about the process. And I got about halfway through the first chapter, and I said, this is the boringest thing I've ever read. I don't even want to write it. And it was then that I realized it wasn't my voice. And so what I did instead was I wrote a book that's 10 scenarios of the future because I'm a storyteller, so I told stories. So one of the things I'm going to encourage all of you to do is when Rex gives you all those cards tomorrow, if there's some there that really resonate with you,